Welcome to the seventh episode in the long-term series Whole of Community Change, featuring today Annalise Jennings, Director of Dynamic Exchange, and Lesli Dahlke, author, researcher, and veterans advocate. Lesli Dahlke is a Southern California native. She describes herself as a lucky child of the 50s, greatly loved by her parents. It was a time of innocence, a time when life was as gentle as a warm breeze, a time of anything was possible. Raised in one of the original, booming, post-World War II suburbs of Los Angeles, she grew up in the shadows of Tinseltown's glamour, its glitter, and the glory days of Hollywood. Her father, Del Moore, was a noted and successful television and movie actor. She later received a Bachelor of Arts degree in television and film production, with the secondary emphasis on the written word of journalism. Her successful career in television production included numerous credits in documentaries, film, and a myriad of television programming. She co-produced the riveting documentary Lesli's Story, Collateral Damage, telling of her cancers, brought on by her exposure to the carcinogen Agent Orange as a young girl traveling with the USO to Vietnam. She's now a contributing writer for the City of Hope, where she's currently undergoing treatment for several cancers. Her professional career was vast, and yet her most personal struggles were still to come. In her profound first book, The Best Is Yet to Come, Dahlke takes us on her life's journey of triumph, strength, and her indomitable spirit. This book is always uplifting and filled with laughter. Annalise Jennings is the Director of Dynamic Exchange, with over 25 years' experience in senior roles in financial services and other sectors including property and small business. She's an experienced facilitator and has led business transformation in project management in large organizations and has an extensive background in risk management and organizational culture. This experience has been gained through working in India, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. She's spoken on transformation and maximizing human potential in a variety of business and community forums. Jennings is passionate about teams and helping them discover healthy working relationships and celebrating success and empowerment. She balances her time between key corporate engagements, her part-time career as an alternative health practitioner, and has always combined her working life with parenting and study. She strongly believes in human potential and is a passionate advocate of ethical corporate and individual behavior in the business community. Lesli Dahlke and Annalise Jennings join me on this, the seventh episode of the long-term series Whole of Community Change at DG Networks, a member of Universal One Broadcasting. Welcome back to episode 7 in the long-term series Whole of Community Change. DG Networks, a member of Universal One Broadcasting, and a great pleasure today to be bringing together Annalise Jennings as usual with our special guest, Lesli Dahlke. Start with yourself, Lesli. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
And Annalise, as usual, great pleasure to have you here. Looking forward to this episode 7 of ours.
Thank you, David. I'm looking forward to it.
Let me start today in this episode 7 in the series by saying that it's a real pleasure bringing you both together. Can I ask you, Lesli, first for a brief background for our listeners on your work as an author and a researcher and as a former film producer and, of course, your book, The Best Is Yet to Come?
Certainly. I am a California native, and I was educated in the practitioner of television production. I have a pretty fairly rounded background in production and film, documentary as well. I wrote a book, The Best Is Yet to Come, and it is an inspirational book about my life and very encouraging and always upbeat and uplifting for those. And you and I are doing a a series on that at the moment, actually.
Thank you very much, Lesli. That is appreciated. And yes, we are indeed, and wonderful it is. And Annalise, may I turn to yourself? As usual, a background, perhaps a summary of where we've travelled in the last 6 or 7 episodes.
Thank you, David. Well, my background is in corporate banking, and a short holiday back in 2009 took me out to Cape York, where I was asked to be godmother to a little girl. And the plan was to be there for 4 days. And in that time, I met some Indigenous elders who got really interested in my conversation. I've always been very passionate about the philosophy of ownership and self-determination and people taking responsibility for themselves, and this whole shift away from intervention to true community ownership. And so they asked if they could keep me for a little while. And so 4 days became 2 weeks, and 2 weeks became 3 months, and 3 months became 12 months, and I never went back to my corporate job and have been working in communities ever since. And so brings me to Napranum, where over the last 3 years I've developed a very strong relationship with the people of Napranum, and in particular with Marianne Coconut, the Thaniquith elder. And the results have been quite remarkable over that 3-year time frame, and certainly through being able to share those stories over the past few episodes. It's been a real joy to be able to retell some of those stories, some of those experiences, and what's brought this community from the second poorest community in Queensland to what is now considered one of the highest profile communities, not only in Queensland but in Australia. So it's a wonderful time for celebration going forward.
Annalise, thank you so much for that. Lesli, out of interest, as you know, I've lived in the States for 25 years, and there you are in California. Being in the Southwest, I spent many, many years touring the Indian nations, particularly in Arizona and New Mexico, and have many friends there. What's your thoughts as you hear the progress made here by Annalise in northern Queensland in Australia, sort of juxtaposed with the history of America and the Indian nations of America? That must be quite interesting to see what's going on here with this massive evolution in indigenous tribes.
Oh, I just find it fascinating, David, and the work that Annalise is doing is just so wonderful and so heartwarming to see that she's changed her life completely and has given herself to these wonderful people to help with education and empowerment of children. And I believe that all children belong to all of us. I'm just very delighted to be a part of these shows and a part of knowing Annalise and the work that she's doing. I think it's just fabulous.
And with that said, and thank you so much, Lesli, we're going to look at the whole of community change model that Annalise has brought to Napranum since 2009. There are a couple of components in it to discuss today, I think. Well, actually, there's probably 3 or 4, but I'm going to begin with work in community leadership and perhaps parenting. And this involves education because at one point in a prior program, Marianne Coconut, Annalise, was talking so profoundly about the little school in Napranum for the kids. Would you like to paint a picture of that school in Napranum? Because Marianne was clearly very proud of it, and of course your safe house for children is now empty because of the progress made.
Yes, I'd be delighted. I will start by saying that Napranum had its own primary school about 12 years ago, and it was taken away without any community consultation or engagement. And it remains a very deep wound and sore point for the community because the school really is a meeting place. It really is a centre, a hub where mums and dads and children can gather and be part of a symbol of growth. And so when that was taken away, and in particular without any engagement, it was seen as a great sign of disrespect. And since working in the communities, what continues to come up in every focus group, in every engagement, in every conversation that I have, is this real will to say, give us back our school. We want our children to learn about culture and identity. We want to be able to hold them by the hand and walk them to school, which they're not able to do now. What Napranum does have is, and when I came into the community, they had a daycare centre, and the daycare centre, it really is a testament to community ownership because it's 100% community owned and it's run by Indigenous teachers, and it won a state award for excellence. What has happened since the program has come into place is there's been a great call to create a daycare centre. And so Napranum now has its own daycare centre, and it's moving along at a wonderful pace, and it is starting to create that sense of community and that sense of belonging. The will and desire to bring back in that the primary school is still very much at the forefront of people's mind, and there is very much a plan, an intention, I'll say, for that to happen. But coming back to Mary Ann's thoughts, she was referring to the preschool and the kids graduated from preschool and are going off to primary school in the nearby mining town of Weipa. And so they dressed up with their graduation gowns. And it was wonderful because, the elders were able to be there to watch the ceremony and to be a part of that. And it's just so vitally important that that tapestry remains intact, that the elders can be there, that the parents can be there, and the difference that it makes when that school or that entity actually exists inside the community and people can walk there and be part of something that's just so important. And so that brought a lot of joy to Mary Ann and to the other elders that participated.
Lesli, listening to Annalise there talk about the school, so important to not only have the elders involved in those spectacular events, those graduations of these small kids, but also the parents. Is that something, do you think, Lesli, is alive and well in the States? Do you think that this is something that is promoted in the States, to involve the parents heavily, involve the grandparents heavily in the whole process?
Actually, it is. It's rather surprising, but it is. I have several friends who have grandchildren in their, 3, 4, 5 early age, and they actually have a day or two a week that's a grandparent day. And part of the schooling is the grandparent goes and participates, spends the day with the child, and has that wonderful interwoven moment that a child gets with not just the sociability between their peers, but with their grandparent. And they also do it with the parents as well. But I love the fact that, as in Marianne Coconut's version, it's so wonderful because it's our form of elders. I think it's very important. I love it.
So Annalise, Marianne Coconut is so heavily involved there, and you move into Napranum and you become part of this. How was that in the greater scheme of things when you're looking at the components and the model? Was the education a principal objective at the top of the list, or were there other parts of the social sphere there that needed to be taken care of first?
This is where whole of community change really plays a key role, because it's not just about education, it's not just about the students and the educators and the parents, it's also about the elders as mentors and who are leading that cultural identity in the community. It's as much about the young adults, those 18 to 35-year-olds, where the elders are looking to that group to step up as community leaders and the youth are looking to them as role models. It's about every sector of the community getting involved and being part of this process of change. And so in my experience, to focus only on the education piece is only one part of a very big puzzle. And so I felt that the conversation about creating self-determination, the conversation about self-belief, the conversation about moving forward needed to happen in every sector of the community and at the same time, so that we created this huge energy ripple effect of conversation where the whole community was facing the same direction. That was my thought process at the time, and education and the student career life coaching program, as I called it, became one part of a much bigger piece.
Actually, your third component in the model is titled Students Career Life Coaching Program, and you say this involves students 7 to 12 years old, teachers and parents, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Lesli on this. But let me ask you before that, Annalise, because in that you talk about building self-esteem and empowerment. This is really important at a critical time for any child, probably between the age of 4 and 8 years old. How do you achieve that? How do you teach this self-belief, this self-esteem at that age, and at the same time incorporate the elders and the parents in that process?
Well, this is where the daycare and the preschool play a very important role, and where there's an intention to bring back at the very minimum the earlier years of schooling from prep to year 4. And the reason for that is, and this is through feedback that the parents have given me and in my experience and understanding, is those first 8 years of the child's development is so critical in shaping who they're going to be as an adult. And so if in that first 8 years, the parents, the elders, the community is all participating in the growth of this child, then they have a greater capacity to learn about culture, about identity, about who they are and what they stand for, so that when it's time for them to move into a broader, more mainstream education, they move in with a true sense of who they really are. Now, when their school was taken away and the prep to year 4 was also taken away with that, it left a huge gap. It left a huge wound that really needs to be filled. And so that is, where you say, how did we achieve that? It's a work in process, and it's an intention to bring this back. So the community, the elders, the people are very, very clear about what's needed. The work that I started to do around the career life coaching program was working with year 7s in their transition into high school. And that focus was very much around working with the child at an individual level, then working with the student, the educator and the parent, and then taking them into a broader leadership program. But its intention is to get very, very clear about who am I? Who am I in this great world? What do I stand for? Where am I going? How am I going to get there? What do I need to learn? And also, how will I demonstrate leadership in my own community? Because working with Indigenous cultures, something that I've learned is that they don't all want to learn so that they can leave and not come back. Many of them want to learn so that they can give back within their own environment. So how will I demonstrate that leadership within my own community? And therefore, how do I then take that leadership out into society and into humanity? And then the big question, the one that I love the most, is when a young person gets up in front of an audience and says, this is who I am, and this is my legacy to myself, to my community, and to humanity. And that just takes my breath away when at the culmination of the program they can stand in front of a large audience and be able to articulate that. That's big. So if they can do that for themselves at such a young, precious age, their capacity for the future is just enormous, and I'm seeing wonderful things happen. More recently, I facilitated a youth forum for about 100 young people, and some of them then self-selected themselves to come along to a strategy workshop where I had government representatives, community elders, and heads of different language groups. And the purpose there was to create a vision for future generations. And so these young people who had self-selected themselves, about 8 of them came along to that 3-day workshop, and they stood up with the microphone in front of that audience, and they were really clear about their voice, about what they wanted, what their contribution would be, and what they needed from that audience. And as a result, we're taking them to Canberra because one of their big statements was, we want the Prime Minister of the whole of Australia to hear what's important to us. And that really captured my heart. And so we're now taking them to Canberra to meet the Prime Minister so that they can have that conversation with the Prime Minister. Now, that's huge. And so for them to be able to articulate that intention, and for us as adults to listen, to understand, and to make that happen, what message does that give a young person? The message of trust is huge.
Lesli, let me just take this to you. The picture that Annalise is painting here is quite extraordinary, particularly if you're talking about children in that younger age group. What a start for them. Goodness only knows for children in a country like the States or the United Kingdom, this would be enormous. But here we are talking about an indigenous community, a First Peoples community. What are your thoughts listening to this, Lesli?
First of all, I would like to say that I believe that there's a huge, huge connection in the passion that I hear in Annalise and the commitment that she has. You can feel that in her voice and her spirit, and I believe that she has taken this work so to heart, and that's what this giving has been about. And I think that the development of this project is really, really, really a legacy for her. So that being said, I think that the children are just enormously benefited and have a wonderful opportunity of nurturing and support and guidance from the entire community. And I think that that's just amazing in any culture or community, but I just highly praise what you're doing, Annalise. I think it's just wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Identity, you had used the Annalise many times. We talk about identity, don't we? And let's just stay for a minute with the young children and the parents and the elders. Where would you bring into this? And actually, this came up in a recent program with Lesli and myself, but where would we be talking about with these children in terms of personality, in terms of character, identity? Let's just take identity and place that in the sort of the corporate arena right now in terms of the global community. But if you were talking about character and personality in these children, any thoughts on that and how you would apply that description to these children, given the process that they're going through?
The method here is upon each individual to face and almost, I guess, outgrow himself or herself, and to be really active in their own future. So this is about having absolute faith and trust in that young mind knows where it needs to go and what needs to be developed. So, what to learn, when to learn, and how to learn are arrived at through a very, very conscious and careful plan. And so the children go through a process of self-assessing themselves around learnability and employability categories that include all aspects of human development. Now, the teachers actually praise this process because they cover off on many aspects of human development, but there are some aspects around values-driven motivation that aren't always covered off on as well as they could be. And so this process does that, and it's essential through this process that teachers and parents strive to help each child achieve their hopes and dreams. And so it's about the child's vision, not necessarily the teacher's or the parent's vision. I'm a mother of 2 boys, and for the most part I was a single mum raising my boys. And something that I learned really early was that I needed to be a very, very conscious parent, and I always thought that I was. And I thought that being a conscious parent meant working full time, it meant going to university part-time to be able to continue to upskill. I thought it was about putting food on the table, putting a roof over their heads, and being really, really busy and active in creating a future for my boys. But it wasn't until one day when, I was at home and I was trying to cook a meal in between study, in between work, in between taking my boys to their extracurricular activities. And my son was about 13 at this point, and he came to me. I'll never forget it. I was at the kitchen thinking 100 different thoughts about how I was going to finish my assignment, how I was going to get the boys to the next activity, 1,000 thoughts going through my mind. And my son came to me and he said, "Mum, I need to speak to you." And I said, "Yes, David, what do you need?" And I just kept on doing what I was doing. And he said, "No, Mum, I really need you to listen to me." And I said, "David, I'm listening, but I'm also doing all of this stuff." And he said, "No, Mum, I just really need you to stop. And I need you to just turn around and look at me." And as I recall this story, it always brings up a huge well of emotion. And I turned around and looked at David, and he said, "Mum, I'm only 13 years old." And I said, "Yes, David, I know how old you are." And he said, "And my brother's only 11. And I said, "David, what's your point? I know how old you are." And he said, "Mum, I'm only 13, Justin's only 11. He said, "And we've been to 7 different schools." And I said, "So David, what do you want me to do?" And he said, "Mum, for whatever's happening in your life," and he said, "I know that you're doing the best that you can, and you're trying to create things for us, but I want you to promise that you won't move us out of school anymore." And I said, "Well, David, I can't make that promise." I said, "I'm trying to keep up with work, with study, with the 2 of you, and sometimes that means we've got to move." And he said, "No, Mum, I really need you to listen. We don't want to move school anymore. Whatever's happening in your life, you've got to promise me that you'll keep us now in the same school." And I said, "Okay, David, I promise." And he said, "No, Mum," he said, "I need you to look at me in the eyes, and I need you to say again, 'I promise.'" And so I looked at him in the eyes and I said, "David, I promise." And he still wasn't convinced, so he held out his right hand to shake my hand. And he said, "Let's shake on it, Mum, and look at me when we shake on that." And so I looked at this boy in the eyes and I said, "David, I promise," and I shook his hand. And it was in that moment that my son taught me to be a conscious parent. And so this was about listening with intent. It was about respecting the view of a young person. And from that moment on, our relationship shifted to quite another level. Of course, I didn't stop studying, because studying at night school was all about getting a degree, was all about continuing to upskill myself so that I could provide for my boys. We did shift house a few more times, but they continued their education at the same secondary school, and they went on to be college captains and prefects. And they said, Mum, we're going to do our best. You've got our word, and let's do this together. And those two young boys taught me what it meant to be truly conscious and to be truly present. And so I really wanted to share that with you, because had I not had that experience, I couldn't have developed the parenting program. Because the parenting program that I pulled together was all about teaching children to love themselves. It was all about not being afraid to love my own kids, totally and responsibly. It was about being aware of that whole ontological approach of being aware of how my language, my mood, and even my physiology. When David told me to just stop what I was doing and turn around and actually look at him. So my mood, my language, my physiology all played a role in that moment. And so I couldn't have put together an ontological framework around parenting had I not had that experience. And then that led me to, okay, well, what is it that a child needs? And that then led me to creating the Student Career Life Coaching Program. So this is about life experiences. And when I moved then into an Indigenous community, oh wow, that just took me to another level again, because I understood the connection to culture, identity, to Mother Earth, and that we are all part of this Mother Earth, that we are actually not separate from Mother Earth, that we are Mother Earth. And I understood that concept of oneness.
There's synchronicities here, Lesli, because in the series that we're involved in, it talks to your relocations, your houses, your movements. We talked about this. I mean, there's something extremely important that Annalise is raising here, and between the two of you, I'm sure that you understand this a lot more than I would. I'm sure that you share this a lot. But any thoughts, Lesli?
The story that Annalise told was just so moving. It speaks so highly of listening, and listening with our hearts and not just hearing. And your children actually gave you a wonderful life lesson, which you then were able to take and spread. It's just amazing. Sometimes we don't give our little people enough credit for being as wise as they are. It's just a very, very moving story. I just really appreciate your sharing that with us.
Thank you.
I know the education system very well in the UK. I don't know it so well in the US, but I think that what Annalise is talking to here in part in Napranum is an educational system where quite potentially the parents and the teachers are learning more from the children than the other way round. Is that a potential of how education is moving and could move even where you are in California? Is that something that could be considered? Because there's huge wealth there that can be learnt by turning the tables to give the creativity to the children instead of the parents.
I would really like to hope that that would be the case. Here in Southern California, we have a lot of magnet schools, and they particularly focus on an area, whether it's science or math or the arts. And a lot of children go to these particular schools. They're part of our school system. And I think because they have such a focus on an area, they concentrate very thoroughly on everyone participating. And I would like to hope that we could be moving in the direction where we value education more than we do now, and that we fund it. That's a big, touchy subject, but I don't believe that we in America value enough of our education to put money where we need to put it.
It's an interesting point that Lesli raises there, Annalise, and that's funding. Not exactly on our narrative today, but worth just briefly covering. I mean, the funding for even a small school in Napranum, is that a challenge, or is it taken care of in the programs that you're involved in? Is it well supported?
One of the philosophies of whole of community change is doing things with people, not to them. And so one of the early aspects of whole of community change is community engagement. So this is where I go out and I sit on people's verandas, I have one-on-ones, small groups, I go out on country and spend time with people on their traditional lands, and I ask them what it is that's most important to them, what are their hearts calling for, what's deeply meaningful to them. All of that information, and I may speak to hundreds of people, all of that information is then collated and brought into a strategy workshop where that is represented by community, strategic partners, government, NGOs. I make sure that it is well represented in terms of who can take accountability, who can build partnerships, and who can move the program forward. Through there, we develop a community blueprint, and that community blueprint is a strategic plan. It's a vision and values-based plan. And typically the values that community people come up with are around belonging, community engagement, ownership, future generations, and environmental sustainability. They're typically the key elements to the visionary plan. What it means, though, the important point here is that once that blueprint is created, it becomes a benchmark by which to evaluate and measure future funding, services and programs that come into the community. So therefore, what that means is that if there is a bucket of funding that is allocated to the community can now stand up and say, well, this is our blueprint, this is our community plan. And at the top of that blueprint is the prep to year 3 school, which is currently at the top of their list. And so that enables the community to say, if there's a bucket of funding that's coming into the community, and true to the philosophy of doing things with us, not to us, then the funding needs to be allocated to that number one priority. That is critically important because there are so many instances of where government have put in services and infrastructure that the community haven't asked for. And we're talking infrastructures and that are worth many millions of dollars that then end up being empty, dilapidated buildings because the community didn't want them in the first place. So therefore they're not in line with the blueprint around belonging and ownership. This is a really important factor, and what it does is it gives councils of elders permission to stand up when government or service providers come into their council chambers with a plan to say, well, does that plan align to our community values of ownership and engagement and working together? Is it going to be allocated to our top priorities? And if not, then your plan doesn't work for us. So it's a mindset shift, and the community is leading the way in that regard. And what it does ultimately is that it creates a shift from paternalism, control and intervention to true community ownership. But rather than us focus on paternalism, control and intervention, the philosophy that I've created focuses on what we want rather than what we don't want. And that's a much stronger energy, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, that can take us into the direction that we need to be. Now, as a result, this community has seen 40% increase in community-owned infrastructure and services. So that's huge. So David, in answer to your question around funding, there's always an issue around allocation of funding but this has really created a new way forward. We've cut away from what has kept us stuck to what it is that we actually want.
If I start comparing that to a state like California, where I have lived, which has education to a great extent that is institutionalized, standardized, which is, of course, what we're trying to get away from. What Annalise is talking to here is so fundamentally different and visionary compared to the sort of educational systems you would have in a state like California. Or am I being too generalized there, Lesli? Certainly what Annalise is talking to here is probably way ahead of many educational systems in the States.
I think that the focus on the smallness of this community, the whole community of change, is what makes it different. You are absolutely right, David. The California system is very large and very impersonal and poorly funded. And there isn't enough time in the day to focus on individual children.
Leslie, you just brought up something very interesting there. Annalise, your response to that, because I mean, this is a big issue that Leslie's pointing out here, is that the smaller the classes, the better. The Waldorf is typical of this. They'll have very small classes. They may only have 8 students to a teacher. This may be a big secret for Napranum, is it not, where small is beautiful?
My focus was a little different in how I answered your question, David. Where I was coming from was around allocation of funding for the infrastructure. And so if we're looking at a community like Napranum that wants to reinstate its school, it's now in a position to say, well, this is the number one thing on our community visionary plan. This is our blueprint. So we now want the funding to go towards a primary school in our community. So that's the infrastructure piece and the funding that I was referring to. With respect to how the education system is run, I'm not an expert in that field, but what I've created is a complementary program that would work in any education system, because the emphasis is on the whole development of the student, be it the spiritual, physical, emotional, and mental well-being, and it's designed to engage the abilities, the values, and the strengths of the student, and it engages not only the parents but also the elders in learning about culture and identity. And in fact, through the career life coaching program, we spend a lot of time out on traditional land, learning the ways of the ancestors. But what's really progressive about Napranum is that they didn't isolate non-Indigenous students. When we went out with this proposal to implement this career life coaching program, Napranum very graciously invited non-Indigenous students, because we're trying to create a new narrative here, a new narrative where there is a mutual reciprocal appreciation of cultures. So this is about melding philosophies into lasting reconciliation. Now, in this small part of Australia, in this one community with this small group of students who took part in this, we were able to do that. Now, the degree to which we can take that and expand it, well, that's another conversation, that's another strategy, and that's a dream, a vision, a wish that I believe could be possible, but it's a work in progress.
Absolutely, and there are some really big issues being raised here, but let me just create a segue for a minute. And we haven't really gone down this path before, Annalise, and very struck by your memories of younger years with your children. I'd like to just pass that over to Lesli. This was a very moving event where the children are teaching the parents, in this case, the children were sending a very firm message to their mother, Annalise. Do you remember anything along those lines, Lesli, in your childhood, where there were signs where the parents were the students and the children were the teachers?
as you know, I had the great benefit of parents that were always in the moment and alerted to us and to our needs. My parents always listened to us, took whatever we had to say to heart, and they were not the dictatorial types. It wasn't their way or the highway. So I would have to say that in my particular case, my parents and my sister and I were all pretty much in tune with our learning from them learning from us, but nothing specific jumps out at me.
That reciprocation, though, Annalise, when Lesli talks there about being in the moment, that's really something that would reverberate well, be understood well by somebody like Marianne Coconut. This is really important, working with the heart rather than an over logical sort of linear process. These are the sort of things, surely, that Napranum and its elders and its parents and its teachers and its children really understand, particularly when you're talking about the ripple effect, talking about the creator, talking about that spirituality of a community like Napranum.
When I came to Australia, I was only 2 years old, and we came as a migrant family into this community. And I have to say that those early years were really, really tough. And I'm not sure that they really got a lot easier. My mother was very, very homesick, and my father came out here not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He had this spirit of adventure, this spirit of ambition, this spirit of exploration. He's a pioneer, and so he decided that Australia would be the place to express what was really so deeply meaningful to him. And so we all came across to Australia, and we left our country. Now, we went through a stage of many, many difficulties with language barriers, with feeling that we couldn't find that sense of belonging, that sense of connection to Mother Nature, that to the Creator. Something was a little bit unstuck for us. And so that sense of living in a home environment where my parents were really present, it kind of wasn't completely there for me. But I didn't understand that, and I didn't know what I didn't have. Certainly there was love, but that oneness connection, something was missing. And it wasn't until many, many years later, as a young woman, I went back to Italy. And as the plane was approaching the tarmac of Sicily, I come from the city of Palermo in Sicily. And as the plane was approaching the tarmac, I felt an overwhelming sense of emotion that I didn't understand what it was. And when that plane then touched Mother Earth, it was a very, very overwhelming emotional experience for me. But again, I didn't understand what it was. And I didn't understand until many, many years later when I started to work with Marianne and I started to understand connection to country, that I realised that what I was experiencing was a remembering, a relearning of that connection to Mother Country. And that overwhelmed me and it excited me because I suddenly understood what that fourth dimension actually meant. A few years ago, I took my sons to Italy for the first time to experience my culture, my food, my relatives, to meet all of my relatives. And we spent a lot of time out on the ocean. We spent a lot of time, walking on the beach near where I was born. And Justin, my youngest, said to me, he said, Mum, I realise now why I've never really fitted in Melbourne. And mind you, I had no idea that Justin felt he hadn't fitted in. And I said, why is that, Justin? He said, because I belong here. There's something about this place. He said, I feel like I've come home. I belong. And so this sense of belonging, this sense of connection is so important to our being, to our whole ontological experience. And so to recreate that sense of belonging in a young child and through their whole education experience In whatever way we can do that, in whatever way we can create that is really critically important. And the way that I've felt to best bring this into the programs that I run is by taking them out on country with the elders, with the rangers, and to learn about the ways of the ancestors. And so that's essentially what we do as part of the career life coaching program, so that it's a well-rounded spiritual, mental, intellectual, emotional experience.
We all have traumas from childhood, whatever shape that is. It's not untypical. But what you're talking to, Annalise, is the consistency and security for children in their early years, which is absolutely essential. Many fail in that process, and that's not a judgment. It's life. But I'm really interested here because you mentioned that your mother was homesick. I'd like to pass that on to you, Lesli, because we're going to finish up the program today on another component that Annalise works with, which is called Women of Worth. And I know that we had talked about this as being part of it. And there is Annalise's mother, who is homesick. Annalise goes back to native soil, back to Italy, and I would submit that in actual fact you probably did something not only for yourself, Annalise, but also for your mother. But Lesli, this is really showing in this respect the strength of the woman in the relationship, the strength of the woman in family, the strength of the woman in community. And I know this more than most because of a father who taught me this. It seems to me that the woman is the hub, the woman is the power and the strength and the warrior in these situations. Any thoughts to that, Lesli, before I pass that back to Annalise?
Well, I do believe, as you know, that women have great strength, and it's part of our strength that passes that torch, that information to our children. And I think that one of the most important things that we have is the responsibility to provide an uplifting and invaluable experience to all children. And I think women are an extraordinary, wonderful resource. And like you said, we are warriors, peaceful warriors, warriors that heal and guide. And I think that we as women are just amazing, amazing individuals.
How does that relate to Napranum, Annalise, particularly in the program, the Women of Worth? What is the correlation? How does that work in Napranum?
When I started to look at the Women of Worth is the name that I gave the program, and I asked women what they wanted, what was really important to them. And what really came up on top was to break this cycle of shame and for them to really come through with a strong voice and feminine energy. They wanted to have pride in themselves again, to remember who they were. They wanted to have pride in their community. They wanted to see themselves in positions of leadership, to be able to take the initiative and to not be afraid. They wanted to relearn about their country, their heritage, their legends, their stories, which really resonated for me in the experience that I had when I went back to my own country. They wanted to learn about appreciation. They wanted to be a voice. They wanted to motivate. They wanted to understand their values and their beliefs, and they wanted to learn from the elders. They wanted to leave a legacy and to be a catalyst for younger children. And so when I listened to what it was that they really wanted, I started to feel that, throughout life's journey, there are times when we have to go where we've never been before. And really all we have are our inner resources to guide us. And so the program that I pulled together was about really understanding the nature of change and that path of resistance, how we transform, how we create that inner power. What is that formula for true creativity? How do we manage ourselves with grace? How do we balance love with law? How do we really understand the rhythm of our own spirituality and listen to the voice of God through that? And so these were all of the burning questions that we raised throughout our time away together, and we spent a few days out at a beautiful place called Mangali Falls, where there's just magnificent waterfalls and beautiful nature, and we built little fireplaces and we sang until the early hours of the morning, and Marianne and the elders sang in language. And they said to me on one of those evenings, they said, Annalise, we really want to give you a gift and we weren't sure what to give you. And so we've decided that our gift to you is our singing. And so they sang to me for an evening, and it was just so precious. I'll never ever forget it. And we sat in that circle and told stories. And then we did weaving, we did painting, we allowed ourselves so much self-expression. And so I really resonate with what you're saying, Lesli, about that, the strength of women, and creating that sisterhood became a very significant outcome of spending that time together.
You see, this is where I am out of my depth, obviously. But Annalise used grace, shame, voice. Let's keep shame out of it, but use grace and voice. Any thoughts on this, Lesli?
Well, I love the word grace. I think that it encompasses so much of living and our hearts. Sometimes things just do come along, like she was saying, that you cannot explain and you go with. And I think that part of this whole experience with the education and the children and the elders and the learning is just one of those. It comes along and it has to be taken, and you have to follow that journey, and it's graceful. And the outcome is so powerful for all of these women that will be empowered, which is so, so important.
I'd like to, in the last 5 or 7 minutes, just talk about values. And values actually held between both of you and Napranum. Perhaps start with Annalise on this, because clearly only having a 60-minute conversation, and I'm sure it will not be the last between the two of you, there are already apparent values, certainly memories of childhood, certainly memories of mums and dads. You'd like to take up on that, Annalise, as to those values, because it's extremely important if people are going to become involved both ways, with Napranum, outside of Napranum, with a country like the United States or the United Kingdom, so that everybody can co-create, particularly in an indigenous community like Napranum.
Well, I come back to my own experiences when David and Justin taught me that lesson about being a conscious parent. And I made the decision at that point that I wanted to raise resilient, resourceful, and compassionate young men. And so that became my guiding light. And so everything that I did from that moment forward was to feed that intention of raising resilient, resourceful, and compassionate young men. And looking back now, and my sons are in their mid-20s now, and I look at them now and who they are, and how they live, how they interact, and I do believe that they are well on that path of service and contribution, and I do believe that they are resilient, resourceful, and compassionate young men. And so for me, it's about, when we talk about values, it's for me to be really clear about what my values are as a woman, as a mother, and to be able to then take that into my family and then take that out into society and into humanity. But if I can't do that for myself, and if I can't be that for my children, then I really can't be that for community and for humanity. That is the ripple effect. And so I've got to I have to have that courage to drop that pebble for myself and watch those ripples expand. And in fact, I do have a little tattoo of courage that just came to mind. That's the only tattoo I've got.
Can I ask you, Lesli, for your thoughts to Annalise's life, and then perhaps I could ask Annalise for her thoughts about your life, Lesli. It's interesting to compare and realize how similar we are.
Well, that's the most interesting part. I was thinking how absolutely similar and yet so totally different where I'm sitting and where you're sitting and where Annalise is sitting, and yet we're all just really exactly the same. Our goals are the same. Our outlooks and our hopes and futures are all in the positive direction, and yet our cultures are so different, and yet we are really one.
Annalise, can I pass that over to you? Because not only is this a question for yourself, a question globally, a question around the conversation with Lesli today, but also a question that is well appointed to Napranum itself.
Look, I believe that we're all interconnected, and so the path that we take, and I remember reading, Lesli, reading your biography a little while ago and being so completely inspired by who you are, what you stand for, how you've lived so purposefully and with intention. And so I believe that that's what resonates for me, and that's what brings us together, is that we have lived with purpose and with intention, and albeit from different parts of the world, and we've come from very different experiences, it's that common bond that really resonates to live a life of purpose, contribution and intention that, brings us together in this conversation today.
And with that, I'm just going to ask each of you a final statement, if I may. Start with yourself, Annalise. We've talked wide range today, so much in such a short space of time.
Well, I believe that one of my greatest intentions is to leave a legacy of service, contribution and hope for our future generations. And so that's where I would like to leave the conversation today, that our future generations are so essentially important to humanity, and that we need to look after them and to look after one another.
Absolutely. Lesli, I'll pass that over to you. I guess it does, as Annalise comes down to the youth. That's really where we were going today. Your final thoughts for the program, if you may.
I think Annalise just put it just perfectly. It's just such a wonderful forward moving place that we're all in, and I'm so delighted to be a part of this discussion, and thank you very, very much for including me, Annalise, and thank you very much for your kind words on my book. I do greatly appreciate it.
That does bring us to the end of this episode. It's passed by so quickly. I'll start with yourself, Lesli Dahlke. Lesli, thank you so much for participating today. It has been wonderful.
It has. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you, Annalise.
And Annalise Jennings, as usual, a wonderful episode 7 in our series. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much to both of you. I feel very grateful. I feel full and approach today with grace and gratitude. Thank you both.
And to our listeners today, do hope that you have enjoyed this episode 7 in the long-term series, Whole of Community Change, as much as we. You can gain information on this and any other program in the series at the official website, davidgibbons.org, or for international panels, crossingoverthebridge.com. Meanwhile, wherever you are in this world, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.